Having assembled the logs and wagons required to service my sawmill, I now have to start thinking about building the factory itself. This will entail my constructing the buildings and making the loads coming out of the sawmill, which will be primarily planks for the construction industry. While I'm keen to have a go at scratch building the mill's various buildings, being a little inexperienced when it comes to N-gauge architecture, I'll begin with my usual crafting ploy of buying a reference model on which I can base the rest of my work. Starting as I usually do, with a bit of web surfing, I look for inspiration for my mill ideas. But while there are plenty of N-gauge timber yard models out there, many of them are a little too large or too expensive for my tastes. I wanted something a bit more modest that represented a smaller rural Japanese factory, bearing in mind the small overall size of my layout and the space I would have to place all these building models. I finally came across what I thought was an ideally sized model of an N-gauge sawmill by MMR Models UK. It was a pretty basic structure, so lent itself to being used as a Japanese plant, with of course some additional decoration and customisations. The model was laser cut, which does mean it was a little bit chunky, but what really caught my eye was the detail of the log cutting machinery inside the model. This would have been a bit too fiddly for me to scratch build myself, and so made for a great foundation for a mill yard diorama which I could then build upon. Right, let's make a sawmill. So let's begin by taking a look at MMR Models laser cut kit. The first thing that struck me, rather worryingly, was the small size of some of the parts. I'm not good at handling very small parts these days. That's what she said, and some of these ones look very small indeed, and quite fragile. There are clear written step-by-step instructions included with this model, but no diagrammatic illustrations, so I needed to lay things out and kind of process the way things fitted together in a similar way that you go about making a jigsaw puzzle. I decided to start by putting the shed itself together first, before tackling the more complex saw table machinery elements, immediately diverging from MMR's instructions, which recommend that you should airbrush all the parts in the correct colours before assembly. Well, my airbrush sadly is still packed away somewhere, so I decided to crack on with brush painting the model, which meant diverging from MMR's approach to assembly. The shed glued together quite nicely and came with slotted tabs to connect one wall to another. The outer shell put together, I started painting the walls with some acrylic paint. And here, unfortunately, I made my first mistake. The water-based paint soaked into the bare wood material and so turned out a little streaky. I soon wished that I'd spray primed the parts first, but I persevered, and after a couple of coats, the resultant brown paint wasn't too bad. I think the moral here is simply that painting a water-based acrylic paint onto a raw wood piece of material is not the way to go about this. As I said, the wood soaked up the paint, which made it very patchy in areas, but I suppose you could say that this kind of lent a sort of weathering effect, but if I was to do this again, I would do it in a completely different way. For the smaller saw table machinery parts, I instead tried out an enamel paint to see if that would actually take to the wood any better. Here I started to come across a little bit of an issue with these very small and fragile components that I mentioned, like the tiny log prong fingers. Even just touching these delicate parts with a paintbrush broke off a couple of tiny little thin parts, and I had to glue them back together again before painting them. Hopefully I managed to cover up any broken parts with the paint that I used. And once these were glued together onto the table assembly itself, that kind of helped to disguise any breakages. This model really turned out to be a little bit of a test bed for trying different types of paints on the laser cut wood material. Next, I actually tried out using a Tamiya aerosol spray paint on the table frame. This actually worked out a little bit better, and I can actually see now why MMR Models suggest that you use airbrushing to get an even coat onto these small parts. Now next I painted the roof, which was just a simple rectangle of light wood material, but this did not take the acrylic paint so well, and whatever I did, the wood grain of the wood material was clearly visible through the paint and didn't look realistic at all. So I resorted to an old trick for doing scale model building roofs and cut a piece of medium grain wet and dry sandpaper and glued it to the roof panel. This gave it the look of an asphalt roofing material, and with a bit of weathering it looked fairly realistic, sort of. A tricky little bit of the assembly here was the insertion of the log lifts, the kind of grappling hooks that are fitted into the walls of the shed to move the logs down the saw table. This process of inserting this kind of crane into the wall while assembling the shed itself was a little bit awkward for me, but I managed to get all the walls glued together and have the crane parts stay in place until everything was set. Once dry, I glued this to the shed walls and weighted it down with some metal weights and then left it to dry for quite a while. Shed complete. Now onto the tricky bits, the saw table machinery. In this case, I did follow MMR's instructions to paint the parts before putting them together, and instead of using acrylics, I tried using a Tamiya spray paint for the table supports and some enamel paints for everything else. I hope this would result in a smoother and more opaque finish. Some of the parts, like the log forks and prongs, were very fragile, and I did indeed break a couple of these parts during handling. But I glued them back together, and not an easy job because of their tiny size, and used super glue to carefully put the table together. I can't say I'm a big fan of laser cut models, particularly when they're this small. That and the combination of my ham-fisted sausage fingers means I may avoid such intricate kits in the future, but eventually I managed to get everything put together satisfactorily. The end product didn't look that bad, but seeing the size of the finished sawmill, I began to have reservations about whether I'd gone for the right size of model at all. The logs I'd made for my timber freight wagons were a lot larger than the saw table of this model was designed to take. Of course, I could make something like a log trimming machine to go with the sawmill to represent a means of cutting the log lengths down to size manageable for the saw table. But this all made me realise that my original idea for a small scale sawmill didn't match the larger scale of the traffic that I had in mind coming to and fro with my log wagons. In short, why would a small timber yard have its very own rail line with the capacity to bring a large number of logs to it? It just didn't make sense. To match the capacity of my rail spur, it would make much more sense to have a medium-sized timber factory and mill. My small mill could have simply been served by a small fleet of trucks instead of a rail line. And so, after all that, I am now left wondering whether I may have to acquire a second mill model, one which is more of an appropriate size for the timber yard I have in mind. But there you go, you live and learn. Still, it's a nice wee kit that I've made, and it was a lot of fun doing it. My plans for the mill complex of buildings itself might be a little vague, but will evolve over time. But meanwhile, the means of transporting the end product from the mill is pretty much decided on. In fact, I already have this covered in the form of several Japanese Tora high-sided freight wagons. The Tora class wagons are a series of older wooden-side and steel-sided two-axle gondola cars used by the Japanese railways. The car body is made of semi-steel with pressed steel plates on either end panels and 6mm thick steel floor panels, and only the side gates are made of wood. The later models have wood side panels replaced by steel. They were manufactured from 1960 to 1963 but continue to be in use even today, and so they're perfect rolling stock from a layouts period theme of the 1970s. These are general cargo utility wagons, and are perfect for the transportation of my mill's output of bundles of planks intended for roofing batons, floor and decking joists, timber framing and other construction jobs. I have 5 of these wagons, made by both Kato and Tomix, enough to make modest rakes of wagons that should make up an interesting little train coming out of my mill's branch spur line. Wagons sorted, I had to think about creating the load of planks and batons for shipping. Initially, I had thought that it might be easy just to recreate the look of the loads by stacking together thin rods of styrene to emulate planks. That was one idea. However, I'd no sooner quickly tested this idea than one of the nice chaps on the Engage for Beginners Facebook group told me about an even simpler and more realistic method for making scale model timber planks. Quite simply, they suggested cutting up wooden coffee stirrer sticks into 2mm strips to simulate the planks. Now, quite by chance, while cleaning up my man cave, I had just come across a box of these little sticks that I must have borrowed from my last job's cafeteria. Lucky break. So I measured the cargo space of my wagons, settled on a 2mm plank width, and got to work cutting up loads of these little lengths of wood. I decided that it was a bit of overkill to chop up dozens and dozens of sticks just to make a full load, so I copied what I did with my test styrene load and made a false bottom for the cargo, this time using strips of balsa wood. This meant I only had to put together the top 2 layers of planks for the load to look realistic. Additionally, this method sorted out the issue of my original test load looking a little too uniform and flat. I just randomly placed a couple of spare planks on the very top of the load to provide some variation. In reality, the timber load would probably be uniformly packed, but this little trick gave my cargo a bit more of a real-world appearance. It only took me 2 layers of planks to fill the wagon to the top of the side panels, thanks to the balsa wood padding I'd inserted underneath them. That done, I could arrange my random spare planks on top of these in jaunty angles. I randomised the arrangement of these spares for each wagon, and although, as I said, this probably isn't realistic, especially given the Japanese penchant for uniformity, this mixed placement does actually look good. The one difference between creating these plank loads for my wagons and the plank bundles that would sit in my timber yard would be, of course, that I would have to model the sides and the end of these stacks. Quite how I'll do this, I'm not certain as yet. We'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. I will, however, have to make another visit to Costa or other coffee shop before I undertake the population of my timber yard though. I've depleted my little stock of coffee stirrers just by making these loads for the 4 wagons I have. The great thing about using wooden coffee stirrers is that they are precisely the right colour off the bat, so no painting required. I did, however, make some fake retention straps to make the loads look as if they were secured in place. These were just thin strips of painted masking tape. And job done. Quite a simple mod for my wagons, but the end product looks quite nice. I will also use this technique again to populate my sawmill's timber yard with piles of drying or sorted plank loads ready to go. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of MilgeekAchoo, and thank you very much for watching, and if you didn't mind, perhaps consider subscribing and liking this video, just to give me a little bit of encouragement to get off my ass and make some more. Hopefully I'll see you again. Take care.